Okay, so this lecture today is about debt, specifically about the debt crisis and how the debt crisis came about, and secondly about the consequences of the debt crisis. So firstly, what is or was the debt crisis and how did it come about? So you remember from the previous lecture on colonialism, up until the Second World War, almost all the countries of Africa and Asia have been colonized by the European powers, Britain and France in particular, whilst Latin America had come to be dominated by the United States. And during the period of colonialism, these countries' economies have been plundered, neglected and distorted to suit the needs of the colonizing powers. Effectively, a global economy had been created in which the periphery, Africa, Asia and Latin America, supplied cheap labor and raw materials to the core, Western Europe and North America. And this is the analysis of dependency theorists like Immanuel Wallerstein, that the global economy is divided to a core, basically the global north, and a periphery, basically the global south, and the global south basically transfers resources and wealth to the global north. This is also what we mean by neocolonialism. So this meant that at the time of their independence, mostly in the 1960s, the countries of the global south were seriously underdeveloped and in dire need of economic assistance. And this led to those countries taking out loans for economic development from institutions like the World Bank, but also from private banks. This lending was then greatly increased in the 1970s, and this was partly came about as a result of the oil crisis of 1973. Now the background to this is that there was a war between Egypt and Israel in 1973, and in this war the Western countries, in particular the USA, supported Israel. And to punish the West for this, the Arab states who supported Egypt initiated an oil boycott of the West, basically refusing to sell them oil. Now the consequence of this was a massive rise in oil prices. Now this left the Arab states flush with money, which was most of that money then that they found they had, was then invested in US banks. And those banks were then very eager to loan out as much money as they could. So many newly independent Global South countries took out loans to finance development projects and modernize their economies. So you had the demand for loans coming from newly independent countries seeking to overcome the underdevelopment caused by colonialism. And then you had the supply of loans, this massive supply, due to all the what are called petrodollars that had been newly invested in US banks, the newly rich Arab Gulf states making money from the high oil prices, investing in US banks. So you had this matching of high demand, high supply. And the theory was that the revenue generated from economic development would ensure that the loans would be easily paid off. So Global South countries take out a loan, invest it in infrastructure and so on, that creates business opportunities, creates employment, creates tax revenue, enabling you to pay the loan off in the future. However, this generally didn't happen. And this was for three main reasons. Firstly, much of the money that was borrowed didn't actually go necessarily into investment. Much of it just simply went to cover the rising costs of oil and other goods. The 70s was an era of high inflation, partly because the inflated oil prices, which has a knock-on effect on most other prices in the economy, but partly for other reasons as well, such as the perceived failure of Keynesianism and other factors we don't need to worry too much about now. But the point is, a lot of the money simply the borrowed money was used to cover the rising costs caused by inflation, and didn't therefore go necessarily into new investment and infrastructure and so on. Secondly, much of the money didn't go to finance development projects because it was wasted or simply even sometimes stolen. So President Mobutu, for example, in the Congo, became the world's fourth richest man by systematically stealing the loans made to his country. In other countries, dictators awarded multi-million pound or multi-million dollar contracts to badly thought out or badly implemented projects run by their own family members. This was the case, for example, in the Philippines, where pro-US dictator President Marcos, paid $2.3 billion to a company owned by his daughter to build a power plant which was never opened. So then leaving, of course, the people of the Philippines on the hook, responsible for this 2.3 billion debt, for which they never received any benefit whatsoever. But his own daughter received millions of pounds in contract fees and so on. Thirdly, in the 1980s, the US massively increased interest rates. Actually reached 21% up to 21% in 1981. Now, this meant that the size of the debt began obviously to massively increase, and at the same time there was a slowdown in global growth, meaning the debts were growing much faster than the economies that were supposed to finance them. And this is ultimately what led to the debt crisis, leaving many countries in the global south with ballooning debts, mushrooming debts they were simply unable to pay. Now, between 1970 and 2002, for example, African countries between them borrowed around $540 billion. Over that same period, however, they paid back $550 billion. That's $10 billion more than the original loan, yet still owed the rich West almost $300 billion in interest payments in new loans. During the same period, developing countries actually paid over $400 billion in interest payments alone. $400 billion just in interest. So what were the consequences of this debt crisis, of this ballooning debt owed by global south countries to financial institutions in the north? Well, the debt crisis had major consequences, both for borrowers and for lenders. Firstly, and most significantly for the borrower countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America, the major consequence was an increase in poverty. And this is because money was diverted away from areas such as health, education and job creation and infrastructure investment in order to instead pay the growing interest on these unpayable loans. So by 2004, for example, Ecuador was spending almost 4 times as much simply on debt repayments as it was spending on education and health care combined. And this kind of situation was common across most global south countries, and still is actually in many of them. But poor education and healthcare then also led to problems such as unemployment and a rise in disease, which in turn led to greater poverty, creating a kind of vicious circle. And these problems seem to be spiraling out of control, especially when the AIDS epidemic hit Africa in the 1980s. So if you think about it, the two proven things that can help deal with the spread of AIDS are basically healthcare and education. You can educate people about safe sex and so on. You can educate people about how to deal with having AIDS themselves or dealing with people who have AIDS in a way that doesn't spread the virus. And you can increase spending on healthcare to treat HIV, provide HIV drugs, etc., or to provide facilities for people with HIV and AIDS, or to provide contraception, and so on and so forth. But these were precisely the budgets that were being cut in order to channel money into debt repayments. And it looked like many countries would simply be unable to pay back their loans at all. This became especially clear when Mexico defaulted on a loan payment in 1982. Basically, it missed its loan payment that was due. And it was quickly followed by Brazil and Argentina as well. Now, here's the second problem. For the lender countries in the global north, this was also a problem. Because if these loans were not paid back, there was a danger that the banks owed the money would collapse, which could ultimately trigger a financial crisis and bring down the whole global financial system. So in response to this, the IMF World Bank stepped in with new loans to the borrower countries to enable them to keep up their payments on the old loans. However, these loans came at a cost. In return for these new loans, the borrower countries were forced to undergo structural adjustment programs in which public spending was cut